I am interviewing Professor Damien Pfister from the University of Maryland, and we're talking all about digital rhetoric. So, to give you a little bit of background about Dr. Pfister, I'm going to read the little intro from his University of Maryland page. And it says, Damien Smith Pfister is an associate professor of communication at the University of Maryland. His work examines the confluence of digitally networked media, rhetorical practice, public deliberation, and visual culture. Welcome to the stream, Damien Pfister. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Uh,
Um, yeah, so we are having a couple lag things happening. Just be aware of that if you are in chat. But we are going to talk about digital rhetoric. And I first want to know what brought you to digital rhetoric?
that's a good question, and it's I think some uh, complicated pathways. I think I'm frozen for just a second. Let me
Mhm.
catch up.
You have great times with technology. All right, that caught up.
Hello.
Yes, I can
Hi.
see you.
Sorry, we got. Yeah, I just totally froze there. My bad. I'm gonna shut down my iPad where I was streaming the Twitch interface. Maybe that will help a little bit. So apologies. I'm in a land of let's just say complex Wi-Fi signals. So you asked what brought me to the study of digital rhetoric.
Yes, yes.
It's there's certainly no one sort of straight and narrow path. I'd say my path was somewhat circuitous.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have always been interested in technology, in mediation, especially as it intersects with questions of argument. So I was a high school and intercollegiate debater, and so uh, I'm no stranger to the arts of agonism, to arguing back and forth, and testing ideas, playing with ideas. Um, that was for a long time the the best kind of fun that I could have. Um, and so, when I was in college at the University of Alabama in the mid 90s, um, I really sort of stumbled upon communication. My debate coach, Dr. Kerry Crenshaw, was like, hey, we've had conversations and you have expressed some interest in these things that like people in communication and specifically people in rhetoric are talking about, so like, why don't you take a rhetoric class? And I was like, doesn't seem that interesting. Like it really doesn't it just doesn't sound that interesting. I think I'll pass. And so I ended up registering for another class. And Crenshaw, to her incredible credit, came to me afterwards and was like, "Hey, I thought you were registering for this class." And and I said, "Oh yeah, I thought about it, and then I registered for this other class instead." And she was like, "Go drop that class and go register for this one." And so, and it wasn't a class with her; it was a class in rhetorical criticism with Stephen J. Anderson, who's no longer in the academy. But I was hooked. I mean, like from jump, I was hooked on rhetoric, and it really it helped me sort of see the world in a way that um, it just opened a lot of sort of intellectual paths. I ended up at the University of Pittsburgh to do my doctoral work, and um, this is in the early 2000s, so very few people were working on the intersection of rhetoric and digital technology. But one of the people that was Barbara Warnick, who has recently passed, but who wrote a pretty important book in the early 2000s called Rhetoric Online, which I think expanded some people's imaginations about what is possible in this area and what is possible in terms of bringing rhetoric and digital things digital together. So I think that was really important. But I would say that in the end, like the reason I started writing about the early blogosphere is my advisor Gordon Mitchell, who at 4 a.m. in a taqueria in Washington, D.C. after a conference was like, dude, you should write about blogging. And this is in like '04, right? So this is like right at the end of um, uh, the the biggest news of the blogosphere to date, which was the sort of unseating of Trent Lott, which I document in my first book. And that was Gordon and I had been talking about this, but mostly as like just sort of, this is an interesting thing going on in the world. I don't think that either of us really thought about like theorizing blogging as a genre and such. But after that, after the Lott event, the Lott affair, we really started talking about it, and then it's just sort of one thing has led to another. So not a super like intentional path. I didn't go to grad school. I mean, when I started grad school, that was not an option. You could not go to study digital rhetoric, right? I mean, there just weren't enough professors or coursework oriented around that issue. So, yeah, I have, I think, just been lucky to have mentors that have pushed me or guided me towards this area because they thought that it was, potentially a really lively, vibrant research agenda.
Yeah, definitely. What you're saying about at the time not having like digital rhetoric kind of as a field. I before coming to University of Wisconsin-Madison, I was actually in anthropology, and I got a
Oh,
master's in applied anthropology, and my interest was on digital communities. But when I was looking for doctorate programs to go into to study digital communities, I got a lot of anthro. Well, there's only one person who does that here. It's not really like a good thing. Have you uh, looked at our communication department? Have you looked at our media studies department? And that's what really brought me here. And while I was very lucky to have advisors and faculty who supported my interest in digital communication and community, I do think that coming into a field of communication, there's just more support to do things that are a little outside what is typical.
I think that's right. Although, I mean, I also, I think this has changed only recently. People have, I, I, I got accused of, and I often heard, as recent as 7 or 8 years ago, people sort of dismissing digital scholarship as faddish, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or as sort of like the flash in the pan, or not as serious or sustained as, say, historical archival work, or the more like established lines of research. Um, I do think communication is a little more open to things, although I have to confess some, ongoing surprise that we haven't moved a little faster in this direction, given the centrality um, of mediation to communication, to rhetorical studies in particular. Um, a lot of people, I think, still want to theorize rhetoric outside of theorizing media, which I don't personally think is the most tenable or advantageous framework.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at large programs, still, there are, if you're lucky, one faculty member doing work in this area. And so I think I continue to think that this is an area that we've got to invest in, because that is where so much of the contemporary action is, and it inflects every single other research agenda. It inflects our discussions of race and racism and racial rhetorical criticism, right? It inflects our discussion of transnationalism and the global and the planetary. So, I think that there's just so many possibilities with sort of studying digitality that comm scholars are really poised to do some good work in this area. I wish we'd be doing more of it, and wish there was more institutional support.
Yeah, agreed. Seeing changes happening, but often they are too slow for what we would prefer.
That's, that that could be the motto of the academy, right? Too
Yep.
too slow for what we would prefer. we gotta make sure that we practice death by deliberation and death by committee, and maybe in the next decade we'll be ready to to do this thing, to do whatever the thing is.
Yeah.
So
So it sounds like you really see digital rhetoric as kind of central, especially digitalness, central to our contemporary moment. For those who are less familiar with it, and also because it can be defined in different ways, I think, what is digital rhetoric to you? How do you define it?
so it's a good question. But I have to say that actually I don't really describe my own work as digital rhetoric. I don't I don't mind when people do, and I do like sometimes sort of tactically use that because I think it's a recognizable phrase. Um, but I digital rhetoric as a term has a sort of stronger base in English. In composing websites and Instagram posts and writing for social media, writing for digital media. I mean, I think that's sort of the genesis of that term.
Mm-hmm.
And no shade to anyone who characterizes their work as digital rhetoric. I think it can be useful. Um, but my concern with digital rhetoric is twofold. One is that it potentially sort of quarantines digital rhetoric away from the rest of the transdiscipline of rhetorical studies. So, um, it's easy to say, oh yeah, those digital rhetoric people, they're talking about websites and blogs and Twitter and Instagram. It's interesting, but well, okay, yeah, we're interested in those things not as sort of isolated events, but as events that are reshaping cultural and communicative practices writ large. So I think, for in my mind, the notion of digital rhetoric is it's too easily sort of pinned down into a subfield that can then be sort of separated from the rest of rhetorical studies. When I think a better way of thinking about or describing it is that this is something that is it's an ambient condition, right? Kind of following the work of Thomas Rickert and Casey Boyle, Jim Brown, and Steph Sarasso's RSQ keywords on the digital essay. Digitality is more of an ambient condition. It is it's something that is happening in the background that is reshaping the foreground. And so, the way that I've been thinking then about the connection between the rhetoric and the digital, the rhetorical and the digital, is to think about sort of rhetoric and digitality, which I think sort of gives a different spin on thinking about the relationship of the rhetoric, the rhetorical, and the digital. That's why the book series that I'm co-editing with Michelle Kennerly and Casey Boyle at Alabama, which just launched this past fall, it's titled Rhetoric and Digitality. So obviously I've got some commitment to that phrasing. And I think what that orients us to is sort of the cultural conditions of digitality. And then I think it gives folks, a capacious way in that doesn't necessarily presume that we're talking about writing with digital media. The second reason, it's sort of connected to that I sort of push away from digital rhetoric as a frame, is that I think that it oftentimes emphasizes the technical at the expense of the cultural. So my book is called Networked Media and Networked Rhetorics, and in that book, I'm trying to sort of marshal. There we go. Yes.
Plug.
some physical evidence of it in the world. Yeah. So I mean that. To digital rhetorics, and there was the idea of network rhetorics, because I think, at least with what I was talking about with blogging, what was interesting to me about blogging was not the fact that it was digital. It was the fact that it introduced all of these sort of networking logics that were suddenly much easier to advance, or became much more central in the early 2000s. And that's the sort of for me, that was kind of like the conceptual lever that I wanted to jump on a little bit, to think about, how is it that re- rhetoric flows through digital networks in ways that have effects that create processes of deliberative legitimation processes or identification, persuasion, moments of agonism and cultural critique. To me, that was like that's a very capacious frame that allows us to do that. Um, you sort of wonder, like, will we be? I think if we project forward a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to call it digital rhetoric or networked rhetoric, or even rhetoric and digitality may fade as a kind of frame. It's just going to be rhetoric, right? Because and the pandemic has shown us above all else, right, that digitization is spreading. Digitality is becoming more and more of a sort of inescapable ambient
Mm-hmm.
condition, and so I think we need a frame that is wide enough to appreciate that, um, and that's what I think like rhetoric and digitality is kind of poised to do.
Yeah. Um, so, I mean, our ability to do this interview and our ability to put it out on to Twitch is all about that digitality, right? Um,
That's right.
yeah. So if we
Well,
think of it, oh, continue.
no, so well, I was
Uh,
just gonna say, like one of the sorry, I got a little Zoom lag working here.
yeah.
Um, one of the things that uh, think about one of the terms that has sort of faded um, in importance as we've gone through the pandemic. And that term is face to face. Like Zoom class is face to face, right?
Mm-hmm.
So well, if you're not staring at a wall of black boxes, that is, right? But people have made this distinction for a long time, and it's been fading for a long time, right? But the difference between online and offline, well, that difference is sort of fading, right? Because we're always online, we're always connected to the digital networks. At least those of us with the class privilege to be so. Um, Face-to-face versus digital, or face-to-face versus online, also seems to be fading, since we're speaking face-to-face now,
Mm-hmm.
but we're not obviously in the same room,
Or even the
so
same
that
state.
or the same state, right, and so uh, yes, there are screens mediating, and no, this is not exactly the same kind of conversation that we would be having if we were in the same room. We wouldn't have to be dealing with Wi-Fi connectivity issues and Zoom lag kind of stuff. But so I think like we're evolving our vocabulary and our the ways in which we're thinking about digitality in ways that are changing some of these like conventional distinctions that may have had their place, in a time in which most people access the internet through a desktop computer, right, or
Mm-hmm.
a laptop or something. But obviously that is changing with mobile phones and Apple Watches and augmented reality not far in the future, and all of these other things, right? So, um, yeah. So
Yeah. Papaya Pop in chat asked, so the digitalness simply becomes a substructure in support of rhetoric.
yeah, I like that. I'll co-sign on that. I mean, that's, I think, the notion of ambient rhetorics, is one of the most, I think, important theoretical contributions that we've had in the last, I don't know, in the last little while, I'll just say. Um, and I think so, thinking about it as a substructure, right, as a background condition, that's what I find really useful about Rickert's book. Was um, he concedes Richard Lanham's point about how rhetoric is an economics of attention. That's something that's an argument that I have a lot of affinity for.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think following Yves Citan, I'd say maybe it's an ecology of attention rather than economics of attention. But um, and so what Rickert wants to do is suggest that, yeah, rhetoric is an economics of attention, but it's not just human agents that shape attention. right? It's the non-human agents around us. It's the built environment, um, with John Durham Peters, we could say, right? It's the elements: fire, water, earth, air. It's um, the network of wearables and the Internet of Things that are becoming communicative agents in a way that uh, non-digital objects are not. And they're communicating with us. We're interacting with them. We're being responsive to them.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these things, yes, I mean, provide a kind of substructure of communication, right? It's part of our infrastructure of rhetorical activity.
Yeah. Speaking of non-human outside communicative forces, I don't know if you can hear one of my cats meowing. Um,
I couldn't tell whether or not they were objecting or affirming my claim right there. So
I think that he's affirming and also saying, pay attention to me. Listen to what this guy says and now pay attention to me.
right.
Um, I'm interested in your research that you said that just launched, especially about like wearables and like trackables, that kind of stuff. Especially because as you're talking about how we're always connected, I had that realization of, oh yeah, I have a Fitbit watch. I do wear that to sleep to like track my sleep. That means even when I'm turned off, like sleeping, I'm
Mm-hmm.
still on network.
Mm-hmm.
So like this is a little side thing, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit more of that about that.
Total, yeah, definitely. So I have a long-suffering book project, like every associate professor, and especially so emphasis on suffering, given the pandemic. It is. I'll just say there have not been many words written on it. It's like so many people. I'm just the cognitive strain and cognitive load is just like not compatible with um, the kind of space that you need for
Mm-hmm.
long form book writing. But theoretically, it's still a project, and I'm hoping at some point to push it forward here as things return to non-pandemic conditions, and as things like as my kid goes back to school and I have hundreds of hours more time next year. So, but the title of that book is tentatively "Always On: Fashioning Ethos After Wearable Computers." So, all this notion of always on is pretty resonant with me. Um, so if we think about wearables, right, they're always on our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, maybe not always, but like for the Fitbit, right? I mean, no one's sleeping in their Google Glass ostensibly, if that's still a thing. But Fitbits and Apple Watches often on even when we're sleeping, which I think is something I hadn't fully thought about. They're always on the network, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then because they're always on, we're always oriented towards them in some way, right? We're responsive to the haptic feedback, the dings, and if you do the weekend warrior step count, battles, your Apple Watch tells you to stand up or breathe, or right. So these are communicative agents that we um, uh, are just sort of embedded in, and so I mean, as I've thought about that, the implications of that, I think it is. Um, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? And so like one of the things that I want to do in my work is to not say wearables are bad because they're always on. No, that's not tenable. And there's just thousands of instances of wearables meeting very specific needs for people. Um, I just bought my mother fall in the fall, and we needed some kind of like fall detection thing, which Apple Watch has. Um, so I definitely don't want to sort of paint with a broad brushstroke and critique all wearables or the idea of wearables. Um, in fact, doing so you know, would be particularly untenable. We have always we are co-constituted with technologies. Some people wear glasses. I'm wearing contacts right now. Any critique of wearables ostensibly might apply not just to wearable computers, but wearable technology like, non-digital, pre-digital
Mm-hmm.
contact lenses and so on. So my particular concern, however, is the ways in which, to use that famous academic locution, the ways in which being always on produces technoliberal subjectivities. So this idea of technoliberalism, which is really neoliberalism intensified by computational power, but the same sort of, uh, emphasis on individualism and competition and market logics. That's that's really just amplified in the context of big data and
Mm-hmm.
passive recording, that wearables offer. That's my real interest. Is, as people continue to buy up wearables, they are participating in the sort of techno-liberal ideology. And I mean, I could go into more detail about that, but my suspicion is that that's probably not the best thing for people. Misty Yang and I have tried to theorize some principles of
Mm-hmm.
techno-liberalism in an essay in the special issue of Communication to the Public that Dr. Rob Asen edited. And in that piece, we're really sort of concerned with with the ways in which techno-liberalism facilitates this kind of managerial white collar attitude towards technology. So, if you think about the what kind of culture is the Apple Watch trying to facilitate, with the reminders to be mindful or to breathe or to close your circle by standing up and move. Well, it's tailored for a work environment in which you're mostly sitting in front of a computer, right? And so these are efforts to extract more productivity out of workers by having them stretch their back every hour, get up and take a little walk. It's sort of a topos of this critique of liberalism, neoliberalism, or techno-liberalism. Um, these tend to be, I think, sort of patches that deflect more radical changes, or more radical possibilities. Um, I think the Fitbit is a good example of this. This is one of the case studies in my um, like I said, long suffering book. So, and again, like I don't think less of you or anyone who wears a Fitbit. I have worn a Fitbit in the past, but billions of dollars have been invested in Fitbits, and I think, like, what would, if we had invested that billions of dollars in making, like, sidewalks in suburbia, or parks, or youth rec leagues, or, right? I mean, there are other ways of thinking about using that money, that I think would have a much greater impact and a much more sort of structural, infrastructural impact. If we think about, yeah, so I mean, that's a good example, I think, of how, like, we have gone to these wearables to solve particular problems, right? To activity trackers, or to track, pulses or whatnot. And in so doing, my suspicion is that we have, um, we've it's like it's the Band-Aid, right? And we haven't really addressed the root cause of these issues, and so we're just going to kind of stumble along until there's some kind of crisis, and we make another kind of decision about funding public infrastructure again in order to improve public health, or maybe that's not the option, and instead it's implantable activity trackers will be the next big thing. That they're even more precise in the Fitbit because they're in your brain, and or whatever whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that this is also a theme that I've seen in your writings, and I'm not going to test you on any of your writings, be like, what did you mean on this page? That is not what this is about whatsoever.
Oh no, I have plenty of people look at my writing and say, "What did you mean here? What, this is what?"
I mean, fair. I think that happens to most academics at some point, right? But not the point of this interview. But what I wanted to say about that is that this theme of, you say in multiple articles that often the solution we have to a problem created by technology is to make more technology. And as you're talking and mentioning how this money could have gone into like sidewalks and like maybe street lamps and things, other than Wisconsin winter, because I am born and bred in California, so I don't deal so well with snow. The biggest deterrent for me to not go walking is that my neighborhood doesn't have sidewalks on each street, and they don't have street lights, like street lamps, sorry. So it doesn't matter how much I wear the Fitbit if I'm not motivated through other means that are completely not related to digital and network technologies to actually go and do the thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a healthy cottage industry of critiques of technological solutionism that are out there. And I mean, I basically that's one of my inspirations actually for getting into this. I had a political theorist professor in the Department of Poli-Sci at Alabama named Dan Pound, who he was really an inspiration to my thinking about this, and he really emphasized the faults of technological solutionism. And the thing that he would run at the most, and you have to remember, like, this is like 1996 in Alabama. He would basically argue with people that they shouldn't drive. So the automobile was his like point of critique, and he would talk about like, oh, you want to talk about efficiency? Do you want to know the most efficient way to move goods and people? The train. Right? So, and people would just, people would take the bait, right? I mean, people would just be like, no, but my car and freedom and autonomy, and he would play with them in such a way as to sort of show how the development of the automobile has basically required a series of technological solutions, highways, right, that have, for example, that have had cultural consequences, like paving over specifically African American places in the city, right? And by the end of the class, he was a master pedagogue, and so people would he would just like insert that little bit of cognitive dissonance into the conversation, which in some ways is the only thing you can do as a professor, right? Is sort of raise some questions and hope that people pursue them on their own. So yeah, I think that is, and again, that's sort of a topos in these discussions about liberalism, neoliberalism, techno-liberalism, is liberalism tries typically orients itself towards sort of technical fixes, and in so doing sort of diverts our attention and our energy and our politics from the more substantive, infrastructural, ecological conditions that I think if we're going to improve on any metric, right, public health of our democracy, we have to think a little more boldly about the scope of the problem and the scope of any potential solution.
Yeah. So there are two things in chat from a couple people. Papaya Pop is wondering if devices can also help motivate people to go to parks, gyms, and to the sidewalks and everything. And I think that's something that's been brought up, is that you're not saying technology is neutral. You've been very clear on that, but that it also does not have to be good or evil. It doesn't have to fit into one binary category here.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I definitely don't want to discount the motivational properties of any device. It's there for sure. Um, when I went to the Consumer Electronics shows, CES, you know, the big rollout tech show. Um, 5 or 6 years ago now. I think it was the 2016 edition, and one of the things that was a real theme throughout that whole show was how do we motivate, how do we motivate people to do things through wearables, and how do we motivate people to get the most out of their wearables? Because most people, with most technologies, only use the sort of surface level features or capacities of it. People on your TV, most people aren't going to settings to do this, that, or the other. There's probably Twitch functionalities that you and I don't really take advantage of, even though we could. There's things with Fitbit and Apple Watch, etc., that you can do, but most people don't. And so the notion of like, how do we motivate people to use our things and to use them to sort of the maximal capacity, was something that I heard in a recurring way. The question of motivation is one that, with a long history in rhetoric, right, that stretches back at least to Kenneth Burke, who wrote with grammar of motives and rhetoric of motives and symbolic of motives. So I think that the question of motivation is almost always, by whom and for what ends,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so, who is it that is motivating us with techno-liberal wearables, and to what ends are they motivating us? And just as a thought experiment, I'd like to think about, alternatives to the kind of corporatized wearable tech that we have. There's lots of open source wearables. There's wearables that have been developed by communities of disabled people, disabled technologists. There's wearables that are being developed in university contexts that are not driven by profit motives, that are driven more by a sense of public good. And in many of those cases, the answers to the question of motivated by who and for what ends is quite different from Apple and Amazon and Google. So I think that's one of the beauties of rhetoric, right? Is that it sort of helps us expand the scope of our analysis and of our understanding, to understand not just technical artifacts, and though maybe the rhetoric specifically, like immediately in that orbit, but to also think about some of the larger cultural consequences, the larger ideological implications, the
mm-hmm.
larger questions that it encourages us to ask about power and difference, and that's why I think this area is just so interesting.
So I'm going to just say Zehe in chat brought up the example of Pokemon Go. You mentioned augmented reality before, Pokemon Go being an AR game as well. So Zehe says Pokemon Go seems like a good example for thinking about that. AR that got folks out and about and interacting with one another, but also generated data for what Zuboff calls the human futures market. And I also admit that I am very much someone who still plays Pokemon Go. So there's actually, in addition to collecting the data, they have actually added a feature to it where you're supposed to scan Pokestops. So they're actually having then their players gather data for them, which is an interesting place to be, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great example of the both and, right? It both Pokemon Go, and I'll admit I know about this from a distance, not a trainer myself. Pokemon Go, on the one hand, certainly I can remember when it started, it really fueled so much sociality. I mean, it wasn't just people staring at their phones. It was people working together, people out in public sharing, oh, there's a critter over there, you got to go get, or there's, go over here. Um, and so I don't think that we can dismiss the positive value of something like that. Um, but we also, need to couple that with an understanding of, uh, of the bigger picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
That this is an incredible opportunity to scrape data about patterns of human movement, about the built environment, about clusters, how people cluster, how they interact, um, and what do they do with that? I don't know, but we should probably be a little skeptical of that. Um, I think that question cited Zuboff. Is that the
Yes.
Shoshana Zuboff
Yeah.
surveillance capitalism book?
Zehe
Yeah,
is another grad student in our program. I
right
don't
on.
know
Cool.
if you want your name put out on the internet, so I'm not gonna say it right now until you give permission, Zehe. So.
Yeah, yeah, I can work with Zehe. Um, there's a quote from that book that says that something like, I quote it in the Democratic Cicadas Fascist Ants piece that came out on the Journal for the History of Rhetoric, that says something like, software engineers um, come up with the music that will make users dance, right? It's essentially a claim that with all of the data um, that these large corporations can scrape, they can manipulate
Mm-hmm.
at scale the behavior of individuals. So while the data collected by Pokemon Go may seem innocent, right? Okay, patterns of people's movements and so on. There's probably other ways you could get that. That's, some of that's publicly available or it could be figured out. But, this is certainly at a level of granularity that, a surveillance camera can't capture. Um, might they be able to use that to, target advertisements in the future that are, geolocated? Um, the Geo-Fencing phenomenon is another good example of this, right? Where you, like, if you stop at a in the before times, when you went to the mall and you stopped at the jewelry display case, a lot of these places have a trigger now, and so then they'll keep serving you, Macy's jewelry ads on your Twitch feed or Facebook feed or whatever, um, and at scale that produces a lot of profit for these corporations, right? So I think we can think both and, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's some sort of pro-social, positive, for the public good for these things, but then there's obviously like some behind the scenes algorithmic manipulation that is enabled by these large data scraping endeavors, and wouldn't it be nice to have one without the other, right? Like, wouldn't it be nice to sort of think about think about digitality in such a way where it wasn't just an excuse for corporations to hoover up all of our individual data and individual preferences and stuff, and that's I think that's the larger conversation that I'm trying to participate in,
Yeah.
is to rethink digitality, to think digitality beyond its corporate strictures. And I'm just so lucky to be thinking along with so many fantastic scholars in rhetorical studies in the larger humanities that are oriented towards that very goal.
Since you mentioned rethinking, there was a question that I wanted to bring up, and this is that one of the books, the one that you are co-editor on, Ancient Rhetorics and Digital Networks, that can seem to some people as like kind of opposing, because they think of the digital as like the very contemporary moment, and then you go to the ancient, and you actually do in a lot of your articles make connections to like those ancient Greek terms, citing Cicero in some of them. So I was wondering if you could talk about the connections that you've made there, how you see them working together, rather as like how some people see them as opposing.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's an incongruous juxtaposition, right? And that is, I think, part of its charm, right? Because like, what could Aristotle possibly have to say about Twitter? Of course, if you're a rhetorician, you may be a little more inclined to play that game, right? Um, I do when I came here to the University of Maryland. Uh, 5 years ago, I happened to be in line with my dean, Dr. Bonnie Thornton Dill, who comes out of women's gender sexuality studies, and is brilliant intersectional feminist theorist herself. And she, I think the book had just come out, and we were in line, and she was like, I was a new hire, and she was like, Damon, hi, how are you doing? What's going on? What, you got any news for me? And I was like, well, yeah, believe it or not, we just got a contract or it just came out that for this book, Ancient Rhetorics and Digital Networks. And she sort of looked at me like, huh, that's an interesting pairing. What's the, what's the, and so, I got to explain it then too. I think the ancients the ancients continue to be good thinking partners, right? I mean, and I think, as we say in the introduction to the book, my co-editor Michelle Kennerly at Penn State and I, um, as we say, every generation sort of has to rethink their relationship to the ancients. Dr. Kennerly, one of the things that Dr. Kennerly does is reception studies, right, of how ancient traditions get received and transformed in various ways. And of course, we're seeing this with alt-right, who largely fetishize Sparta, but also the so-called whiteness of the Greco-Roman tradition, which I always just find hilariously uninformed, since the notion of whiteness is a modern invention. There's no sense of race in the ancient world, although obviously like there's an appreciation of differences. But I think that like we continue to be able to extract some wisdom from ancient sources, and not just Greco-Roman sources, although that is sort of traditionally the wheelhouse for for rhetorical theory. We're in a moment now where people are pushing beyond that, have been for 25 years in really productive ways. So we have a number of chapters in that volume you just mentioned, Ancient Rhetorics and Digital Networks, that do focus on ancient Indian traditions or Buddhist traditions, and that's something that I think is a real potential for growth in this particular area, sort of thinking about how different cosmological, mythological, rhetorical traditions are shaping the development of digital technologies in different ways. I think for me, a new medium of expression like digital media offers us an opportunity, just a different vantage point to think about the ancient world and about ancient rhetorics. And it gives us an opportunity to think about how effective these ancient terms are in describing contemporary rhetorical practices. I of course think that they do, right? That there's sort of some in a lot of ways, like I don't think we can escape it, right? I don't think that we can make it go away, because our contemporary rhetoric is obviously sort of built on the gradual accretion of communication practices over time. It's like a crystal, right? That layers of practice are being sort of sedimented gradually, and they're composited by this greater solution. So the various constituents of bodies and technologies and techniques and artistry, and gradually is producing that which we call culture, produced through communication, through these just layers and layers and millions of acts of communication. So to me, the challenge is not to just say, I think and I think it's somewhat fashionable now to say the ancients, old news, shitty gender and race and class politics, like obviously, and so we just got to like throw them out. Um, I don't know that we could if we wanted to, and so to me, it offers an opportunity to reread some of these ancient texts and to think through, like, okay, how does I don't know if this can I curse on this stream?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, all right. Can we address the shittiness of these theories and acknowledge their limitations, um, and maybe recuperate them in some ways that are capable of transcending the origins of their production. I mean, there's no perfect politics. There's no innocent origin. All of our concepts, all of our ideas are have been incubated in suboptimal social conditions. Even the ones that are incubated right now, like let's not let ourselves off the hook. We're still obviously dealing with structural racism and sexism and problems of power or issues of power still shape the contemporary moment and our contemporary theorizing about it. And so the task for me is like, how do we be in conversation with various ancient traditions in ways that open up more liberatory practice as we lean into the future. And I think that it's a particularly vital task because I think you can draw a crooked line, but a line nonetheless, between Plato and techno-liberalism in terms of how they think about truth and epistemology. And so rhetoric's more, comparably more democratic orientation and tradition offers us some opportunities to contest that sort of dominant approach to techniques. And that's really that's the big kind of theoretical issue that I'm hoping to address in my book. So I think that rhetoric continues to offer some resources, and I think that especially as more especially younger scholars get interested in the transnational dimensions of digitality and understand how different cultural traditions offer different resources to think through some of the challenges that digitality poses, then we're going to be in a better place, to ensure a future that has dignity and freedom at the center.
I feel like I could talk about this for a very long time with you, but I do want to be cognizant of your time.
Fair, yeah.
And we had one more question that I wanted to make sure that we get to, especially for, as you say, younger scholars, and I'm including myself as part of this. So for the more practical side of things, what's your process from the conception of article, chapter, project, whatever the case may be, through to that submission?
Yeah. I wish that I had one. Like I wish that I had well, the Damien Pfister model is, and I just don't. I mean, it's not that I don't have any process. I certainly have got some process, but I think that it's different for different kinds of projects, and it's different for different phases of my own life. I mean, I've never sort of settled into a routine. Every time I think I begin to get into a routine, something happens, like the global pandemic, right? So, and I think that is a challenge that everyone has to face, and frankly, I think we're all going to have to figure out how to do work amidst the global disruptions that are bound to be a part of living in the Anthropocene. Whether it's our friends in Texas who don't have electricity for a week, right? Or global pandemics, or I live by the coast now. I worry about rising rising seas, right? And um, yeah. So here's what I can say about my process. Even as I sort of claim no process, I am an inveterate note taker. So I am always just scribbling. Um, I've got something on a notes app on my phone. I've got sticky notes. I've got journals. I have I've loose leaf paper, or legal pad. Like it got really ridiculous a little while ago because I had like 14 different note places where notes could be, and I've condensed down to like, I don't know, 6. Um, and of course I'm scribbling inside books and noodling around in lecture notes for grad seminars and stuff. So um, I think if I was to describe my process, and those of you who know me will appreciate this, and if you don't know me, then here's a little glimpse into my life. I would describe my process as essentially fermentation. So I have become a fermentation revivalist. I brew my own kombucha. I make my own hot sauce. That some of which is fermented. Um, Making my own sauerkrauts and stuff. In it started before the pandemic, but the pandemic has really accelerated it. It's like, oh my gosh, I've got all this time. I've got a little plot in the community garden, and so I really a year ago at this time, the pandemic was unfolding, and people were like, "Well, okay, UMD just like gave us 2 weeks off after spring break to like figure out what the heck we were going to do in the rest of the, for the rest of the semester." We're like, well, okay, surprise, and so I just poured a lot of my extra time and energy into gardening, and produced these beautiful cucumbers that I pickled through fermentation and stuff. There's something I think very powerful about fermentation as a metaphor for the research process. And so I'd like to think about my note-taking process as basically like taking care of the brine. When you're fermenting something, you basically salt vegetables, you chop up vegetables and salt them and press them down, and the salt makes the vegetables release their water, and then it's basically a kind of watery solution that is typically facilitates the growth of lactic acid and good bacteria, and it then transforms that which is being fermented into something else. So I think about that's essentially, in a way, that's everyone's research process, right? So I think I'm just like redescribing this, like for a long time, I used marination metaphors. Like, you need to go marinate in that idea, with that idea a little bit. You need to go just sit in it. Like you're a zucchini that needs to be in in the chimichurri sauce for a little while before you can, you need to just absorb its flavors. As someone studying for prelims, that's basically what you're doing, right? You're just marinating in all of these ideas and trying to figure out, like, okay, how do I make something tasty on the other end of this? But marination has faded in favor of fermentation for me, because I think that what the fermentation metaphor gets more than anything is sort of the transformative dimensions of the process, right? So you're trying to sort of enzymatically break down other people's ideas, and produce something that has their flavor, right? That's informed by their vibe, right? But has its own sort of distinctive thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my process at like the most abstract level you could get. I've got 2 pieces of advice though that are much more pragmatic, and that I think are difference makers. So like when you're writing, especially on a big project like a dissertation or a book, you have to wake up and pretend like the internet does not exist. The internet does not exist for you until noon. When I did this, when I was writing my dissertation, you invariably spin your wheels for the first 6 months or so. False starts and trying to figure out what you're going to say and what your unique contribution is and whatnot. And it's real easy to like take a quick break to check something, or look at. Back in the day, it was Facebook. Now you've got a gazillion options. And then 20 minutes later, I mean, your day just gets chipped away like that. But more, I mean, for me, I just feel like when I plug into the internet network, I'm suddenly like my brain is moving in all the, I'm thinking about all these different things, and it sort of takes me away from what I'm focused on. So I have been most productive, and people who follow this advice have generally agreed that like waking up, getting ready to go, not engaging with your email, or with whatever else you have to do. And again, this is like advice that is, I think, better in non-pandemic conditions than now. But and just being able to like focus for 2 or 3 hours on your thing, and then you're done. Stop working on the dissertation. People stop working on the book. Stop working on the article. You cannot sit and write for 6 hours. I mean, productively. You sort of lose steam, I think. Now, there are moments where you will, right? I mean, I had a month a couple of years ago where I wrote like 50,000 words across 3 different projects, and it just they were long fermenting. They were long fermenting. They had and I had deadlines, and so I was like, there was no, and I just like procrastinated on them so much. So yeah, there was a lot of like butt in the chair kind of moments where I was writing 6 or 8 hours just to meet these deadlines. But typically, I think most of us cap out at 2 or 3 hours in terms of our productivity. If you can get 2 or 3 hours every other day, you're going to be extremely prolific. All right, so that's my first pragmatic piece of advice. My second, more pragmatic piece of advice is do a little bit of pre-writing to set yourself up for success the next day. The hardest, and this is my process, right? Is that I, with about 15 minutes left in my allotted writing time, I sort of think, okay, what are the next moves that I need to make? And sometimes it's just stream of consciousness. Like I hammer out a paragraph that's like, okay, one paragraph on this, one paragraph on this, one paragraph on this. But the thing that does is it prevents the where was I moment, right? It prevents the like blank page syndrome. It's like it's past Damon giving advice to future Damon for what to do, and sometimes past Damon didn't know what was going on, and I have to go somewhere different. But just giving you that kind of basic infrastructure for the next moves in your whatever piece you're writing is just so helpful, because when we're writing and we're in the groove, and we can see where we need to go, and it's just so hard to get back into that groove. So if I'm to say anything about my process, it is right before the internet and pre-write for your next writing session. And when I am doing that, I am very productive as a writer. I don't always do it. I mean, I don't take my own advice because conditions in the world and in your life have to be right for that. And they haven't been for me lately, like so many of us. But it is, that's as close as I can get to a process. But if you were able to do that for 2 or 3 mornings a week, you will be able to do a lot of writing. You'll be able to do a lot of writing.
So we are slightly over time. I'm sorry, Zehe, that we didn't get to your question, but for those who still have questions or want to see like more about you, where can they find you on our interwebs?
Yeah, I'm here and there. I do keep a website that's just my full name, DamienSmithPfister.net. Twitter is @DSPfister. Don't forget that silent P in that's um, uh, and then yeah, on Twitch I'm Mr. Enthymeme, and I might get more involved here. I've been yeah, I just shout out to my advisee at Doc Brooke is her Twitch handle. She is the one who really has propelled me into the Twitchiverse, and she's a charity streamer and a doctoral student in our program.
She just hit 400 followers as well. I saw that.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, it's been fun to to dip a toe into this. I think we've just seen an explosion of different platforms and different communities in digital context. So it's been a delight to join you and your viewers. And yeah, feel free to. I mean, my email address is on my faculty page, so that would be another way to get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from some of the questions that we weren't able to get to. Feel free to drop me a line.
All right. Thank you so much, Damien. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to sign off. I do have a stream tomorrow. It's going to be a little different, some playing of Pokemon. So come hang out with me for that. But otherwise, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right.